25 cars line up to start the last Grand Prix of the most extraordinary season in the history of Formula One.
This, then, is the clincher, the World Championship decider.
As heavy rain pours down, two drivers prepare for the race that will decide which one of them becomes world champion.
James Hunt, it is McLaren. Niki Lauda in the Ferrari.
The flag is there, the flag is down, and Hunt is edging.
The two men could not be more different. Britain's James Hunt is a fast, flamboyant showman who parties as hard as he races.
James is the driver of the old time, the gentleman driver, the flamboyant, that has the natural talent to go fast in a car.
His rival is the steely Austrian Niki Lauda, who drives with cold, hard logic.
Niki was the scientist, the counterpoint. He was the ultimate, the first really technical driver.
This is the story of Formula One's legendary rivalry, told by those who witnessed it firsthand.
James got out of the car, pulled off his crash helmet, started to rant and rave at them.
Van Miller,
The tension was just amazing.
His face was a mask of blood, and they say, my God, how can he race?
With previously unseen footage and exclusive interviews, this film charts the epic duel that would change the lives of both men and the sport forever.
You couldn't make it up. You could not make up this season. It was just unbelievable.
It's going to be a fantastic race.
Fans line the streets to see Austrian Niki Lauda crowned world champion of 1975. Lauda drives for Ferrari, the greatest racing car constructor in the world. But Lauda's thoughts and those of his team are already turning to next season. Ferrari's team manager, Daniel Odetto, is confident that Lauda will retain his crown in 1976.
Niki Lauda was a very professional driver. He can see the strategy, he can really understand when was the moment to push a little bit more, a little bit less, and was very fast, extremely fast and so consistent.
Es war ungefähr so ein 6-Stunden-Programm, das in der Früh beginnt mit Laufen, über Schwimmen, in die Sauna, in den Kraftraum, den ganzen Tag geht. Das habe ich ungefähr 14 Tage lang gemacht und fühle mich jetzt körperlich viel besser und vor allem oben.
But in Britain, a new challenger has emerged.
Ladies and gentlemen, James Hunt.
James Hunt has signed for British team McLaren, Ferrari's arch rivals, but he is yet to prove he is championship material.
British drivers and British cars, for that matter, have dominated Grand Prix racing, and our domination has dropped off a little bit now. And I just feel very ambitious to take up the cudgels.
I think James was hugely popular because he was an attractive character, he was a Brit, he was loved in this country already. But I don't think people really thought that he had anything like the chance that Niki Lauda had.
Hunt is better known for his romantic exploits than his driving.
I once talked to Jackie Stewart, who had this thing about the car being a woman, and you drove the car like you made love to a woman. Do you have the same poetic turn of mind?
I'd sooner stick to the women.
With his last team, his cavalier style had earned him the nickname Hunt the Shunt. Now McLaren team manager Alistair Caldwell has reservations about Hunt joining the team.
The 76 season got off to a very interesting start for us. James didn't have a drive and we didn't have a driver, so we were thrown into bed with him. He rang me up and said, I think I'm your new driver, and I said, I guess you are. One of the first things you noticed that when the car was switched off on the grid, he was so wound up, the whole car was shaking with his nervous energy. He had a lot of adrenaline in, that's for sure, but that's one of the reasons why he was a good racing driver.
He was always competitive and always very focused on something he wanted to do, be it budgerigars as a teenager, or train sets or Scalex tricks or something as a small boy. James was a sportsman through and through. He never played team games. His sports were all solitary. And he was very single-minded, and he knew what he wanted. He wanted to be world champion.
The 1976 season will consist of 16 races over 10 months, running from January to October at locations across the world. It is not just Lauda and Hunt that are in competition. 15 different teams, each with 2 drivers, are in the fight for the title. But Ferrari and McLaren are the leading contenders.
Ferrari were my arch enemies. Daniel Rosetta was their team manager, so I was at war with them.
Ferrari has a history much bigger, much longer than McLaren.
We couldn't compete with them on money, but we could compete with them in style, and we can compete with them in efficiency. They were a lot bigger team, and they were incredibly Italian.
I think we respect each other professionally, but I don't have a beer with him in the pub, if you want an example.
Race 1 is in the scorching heat of the Interlagos circuit in Brazil. Each race will cover a distance of 200 miles in approximately 2 hours, but first, each driver races against the clock to set the best possible lap time. The driver with the best time will be rewarded with first place on the starting line, pole position. In the thick of the action is pit lane reporter Peter Windsor.
In the distance, you'd hear an engine note, and 4 minutes later, the car would reach you, and all 4 wheels would be off the ground. And you'd think, wow, this is Formula One.
The news on the track in Brazil is that Hunt is fast. To everyone's amazement, he makes the best lap time and gains his first ever pole position.
What I remember most, actually, was Nicky Lauda looking up the pit lane and thinking, what's going on here? Because nobody really knew, including Nicky, how good he was going to be.
You just want to get a level. So if I say shucks and all that sort of stuff, oh dear. Well, I'll cancel it then. Can we rub that out?
He might have had some good lines for the microphones. He might have had a roving eye for the girls. But in the cockpit, he was very serious.
Hunt takes his place at the front of the starting grid, just ahead of Lauda. The world champion's car carries the coveted number 1. But all eyes are on Hunt in car number 11. Lauda gets the best start, with Hunt's McLaren chasing hard behind.
Sadly, in the race, part of the fuel system on the engine fell off, so he flew off the road, which wasn't his fault. So it wasn't a fairy tale beginning, but everybody left Brazil very pleased that James was obviously quick.
Lauda has seen off Hunt's challenge and collects 9 points to start building his score.
Point scoring system was disarmingly simple. 9 points for a win, 6 for second, 4 for third, down to 6th place where you got 1 point. We didn't know it was going to become so complicated.
In an age when Concorde is taking its first passenger flight and synth music is capturing the imagination, Lauda's highly technical approach perfectly suits a time falling in love with technology. Lauda is a complete driver, preparing his Ferrari meticulously before every race.
Nicky stay in the garage until maybe 8 o'clock in the evening to stay with the mechanics to make sure they do the job proper and to understand what they are doing. Because Nicky is a perfectionist. Nicky, what he's doing, he wants to do it his best.
At Lauda's side is his wife, Marlene.
Marlene was a fantastic lady, young lady. Was a beautiful lady, but for Nicky was also a big support, moral support, and I think was a big part of his success.
Lauda knows how to get the best out of his team.
Niki Lauda had really learned how to make Ferrari work for him. An awful lot of drivers, very good drivers, went to Ferrari and never quite made it work. It had the terrifying presence of Enzo Ferrari with his dark glasses looming over the whole thing.
Incidere senz'altro, perché contribuisce notevolmente.
After nearly 5 decades in motor racing, the 78-year-old Enzo Ferrari rules his family business with an iron fist.
Mr. Ferrari lost his temper and he said, I am the boss here, you have to do what I want.
He did have his favourites, and Niki clearly had got close to Enzo Ferrari in that way. But I think the bottom line is Enzo Ferrari liked to win. He loved winners. He cared about the results.
And Lauda delivers, pulling further and further ahead of Hunt with every race. But at the 4th round in Spain, Lauda has worrying news for Alberto.
Daniel, I have a problem. What happened? I fell out from my tractor in my house, in my garden, and I broke 2 or 3 ribs. I said, my God, 2 or 3 ribs.
Oh, he had a gardening accident, I think. I think he was mowing his lawn in Austria with a garden tractor and it rolled on him, which is quite a common occurrence with garden tractors.
James just had this approach to it all, which was, well, he's no problem. Halfway through the race, his ribs are going to give up and I'll pass him and win the race. It was exactly what happened.
There was something in the air that night. The stars were bright.
His first win for Marlboro McLaren. You're still extremely fast. How do you do it?
Big balls.
But Hunt's victory is short-lived.
In the scrutineering area afterwards, there was this unheard-of situation, really, where the car was disqualified, and that was something that nobody in Formula One really was prepared for.
Teams are allowed to modify the car to suit each circuit, but they must work within strict regulations.
1 centimeter in a Formula One car makes such a big difference.
In Spain, Hunt's car had been found to be just over a centimetre too wide.
Before the race, the car was measured by the organisers, and every day they didn't say anything. And I'm pretty sure that they were talking to Ferraris because there was a bit of kindred spirit there, the Spanish-speaking Catholic country, and the Ferraris were saying, shh, stum, keep it stum, say nothing.
I was never involved with the scrutineering. I was involved with my scrutineering, with my cars, that I want that my car respect 100% the rule, because otherwise Ferrari kill me.
Hunt's points are given to Lauda, and it looks like McLaren will leave Spain empty-handed.
We immediately appealed because we thought the penalty didn't fit the crime. It was like being hung for stealing a loaf of bread.
They pretend in the appeal to say that this difference was not affecting the performance of the car.
Had you any idea that the car might be thrown out?
No, I don't know. I just drive the damn thing.
Although their teams are at war, both drivers are trying to steer clear of politics. But despite their different characters, their passion for racing is a bond.
Well, Nicky, he spent time in our pits. He was always visiting us, and his grasp of English was very good. And he was always known as the Rat, because he looked like a rat. So he was called Rat to his face. I mean, James said, hello, Rat. They meshed well because they weren't actually directly in competition from looks.
You got a real type of thing going down, getting down. There's a whole lot of rhythm going round. You got a real type of thing.
The wild side of 70s Formula One is revealed in this recently discovered footage of an after-race party. Hunt is the star, with Lauda in the wings.
Are you ready?
For sure, Nicky was in awe of James's, good looks and personality. James was the good-looking playboy, and Nicky was the small Austrian who looked like a rat. They were good friends, though on the racetrack, of course, no quarter given, because that's the race driver persona can change completely once on the racetrack. So all this is forgotten. All successful racing drivers are invested with an enormous ego. They all think they're the quickest. They can't imagine that they're not the fastest racing driver in the world. To admit to anything else but that would be ludicrous. Nicky and James both thought they were the best racing driver in the world.
As the season approaches halfway, and even when the points from Spain are reinstated, it's Lauda who still dominates with double Hunt's points. When the Grand Prix circus moves to Britain, the country is sweltering in temperatures reaching 35 degrees centigrade.
Skirts were getting shorter, it was getting hotter. England was baking, the whole of Europe was, it never rained. We slept in the garden for months. It was quite a remarkable year in more ways than one.
But behind the sunny mirage, Britain is in the grip of political uncertainty and economic upheaval. Inflation is rampant, and for ordinary people, the future is anything but certain.
We all know how hard the employment market is just now for new entrants, and I know how much harder it is, and has been for many of you, to get your first job.
The return of Hunt is a welcome distraction.
I think the British public saw James as a sort of hero figure.
Hello, girls.
Somebody they could admire, who was giving two fingers to the establishment. It looked good in perhaps what might be a rather austere time for other people. He had a sort of freedom about him. He didn't really care what people thought.
Hunt's unpredictable personality is a potential problem for the team's sponsor, Marlboro Cigarettes.
Off we went, and I managed to... Excuse me, I've been training for my new sponsors.
Image is everything for the American brand, and John Hogan, the man from Marlboro, has been tasked with keeping the young sportsman in line.
He was this very brash figure with a trail of destruction behind him. So that was going to be new for McLaren, which is quite a straight-laced organisation, and also for his sponsors, which are also straight-laced organisations.
In the year colour television sales overtake black and white, Hunt's car flashes Marlboro's distinctive red and white brand across the screen. And with it, he brings his own unique splash of colour.
Turning up to a dinner party in black tie and flip-flops was, to James, pretty normal. And because he had this, what I don't know, what the British call savoir-faire, he was able to sort of carry it off.
James changed the way Marlboro looked. It was the first and probably the only example of a sponsor being moulded by the driver and not vice versa.
This is Brands Hatch, just outside London in the Kent countryside. And today is British Grand Prix Day, the biggest day on Britain's motorsport calendar.
The race is sold out. Britain is in the grip of Hunt fever. A record 80,000 spectators fill the circuit, and all eyes are on one man.
Brands Hatch is packed. Every grandstand is packed, every grassy bank is packed. And the reason, because they're hoping to see the first English victory in the John Player British Grand Prix since Peter Collins won, in a Ferrari, of course, way back in 1958.
At Brands Hatch, what you had was a front row after qualifying, which looked as though it was setting the race up perfectly, because you had Niki Lauda and James Hunt on the front row, Clay Regazzoni behind in the other Ferrari.
There is drama right from the start.
Clay Regazzoni managed to drive into the back wheel of Lauda, so the two Ferraris actually collided. Complete mayhem began.
Duffy sends Hunt flying.
James's car landed on the left front corner, but being a McLaren didn't brake, and being James with the 2 pints of adrenaline, he didn't stop. He charged off with the front wheels splayed out like this.
Drivers who escaped the pileup are soon flagged down and the race called to a halt.
James was immediately thinking, I've got to get back to the pits and have the car mended.
I got out of trouble completely. I never hit anybody. I stopped to the left, and they came apart into it. Tell us what happened. Well, I know there's a race going on there, boy.
The race has ground to a complete halt. The organisers want to restart immediately, but Hunt's damaged car is not on the grid.
And in the chaos in the pit road, comes running up to me. I said, what's the car like? He said, oh, the car's destroyed. The car's a write-off. I wandered down to have a look at the race car and realised that the race car was repairable, that James's explanation that it was a write-off was not true.
Caldwell and McLaren will have to act quickly. There are only minutes to spare.
It was thought that James Hunt would not be allowed to take the restart.
And the crowd got behind James as a driver they wanted to see in that restart in a way that you don't see outside a soccer match.
A slow hand clap which ran from the start-finish line all the way up to Paddock Bend and all the way round South Bank and round to Westfield Bend, and then it became boos, and then it became catcalls. Then the marshals had to rush onto the track to pick up beer cans and Coke cans and even bottles. I've never seen at a motor race quite such an extraordinary display from the public.
We want James Hunt, we want James Hunt. This mini riot that was going on, which was, not very British.
McLaren were delighted that there was this confusion and delay because it gave them a little bit more time to mend James Hunt's car.
When they return to the grid, the crowd goes wild. Now James Hunt is certain to start again.
Well, Ferraris, you could see them, their faces fell because they knew instantly what had happened, that we had fixed the race car.
And what I remember most of all, actually, in all that, is Niki Lauda in a rage getting back into his car because he'd suddenly realised how much time had passed and that McLaren had had time to prepare their race car again and get it onto the grid, and he was absolutely livid.
Back to the grid, and off they go again.
After another chaotic start, Lauda storms ahead with Hunt chasing hard on his tail.
The battle's really on now between Niki Lauda and James Hunt.
Niki Lauda in the Ferrari leading, James Hunt cheered on by the British crowd, gradually winding him in. As we went past half distance, I was going round Paddock Bend, down to the bottom of the hill, up the hill and behind the trees. As the cars then came back into our sight, the McLaren was in front. And that's when the crowd erupted.
Britain's James Hunt in a Marlboro McLaren wins the British Grand Prix.
And we did win the British Grand Prix fair and square.
James, how much does this victory mean to you?
9 points, $20,000 and a lot of happiness.
How remarkable.
Can you give me a cigarette? Can I grab that cigarette off you? Thanks.
But Ferrari is about to spoil the party.
I think Ferrari appealed straight away after the race that, that we were, we didn't comply with the rules. We couldn't work out what kind of rule they thought we hadn't complied with.
The rule says, and I am surprised, but I'm not surprised that Alistair doesn't know well the rules. That is another example, no? That you have to complete the race course even if the race is suspended.
Instead of completing a lap, as the race was stopped, Hunt had taken a shortcut back to the pits.
In cutting behind the paddock, he didn't complete the race distance. Simple than that.
For now, the race-winning points are Hunt's, but the result hangs in the balance, waiting on a hearing scheduled for months later. The next race is at the notorious Nürburgring in Germany.
The Nürburgring was a frightening but fantastic racetrack. It's 14.7 miles round, goes up and down thousands of feet, it's got hundreds of corners. It was just generally hostile to fast racing cars, which is part of its appeal.
3 times world champion Jackie Stewart had driven the course to highlight the dangers of a track that had claimed more than 50 lives.
Every time I see this, it frightens me, because there's no barriers on the right-hand side, there's just a rock face and trees. You've got a left-hand side barrier, but that's not where you're going to go off the road. I think if I were to walk around them, I would be horrified. I would never drive around the place again. So the faster you drive around the ring, the less you know, and maybe that's the best thing to do. For a quick lap at the Nürburgring, you've probably experienced more in 7 minutes and 6 or 7 seconds than most people have experienced in all their life.
It was a pre-health and safety era. Motor racing was dangerous, it said so on the back of every ticket, and it was part of what it was.
Nearly every year in Formula One, a driver had been killed.
By this stage, I'd lost my brother was a racing car accident. So after that, I thought, I won't befriend racing drivers. I'll have them as people who work for me, but I won't become their friend because I don't want to go to their funeral as a friend. I want to go to the funeral as their team manager.
For Lauda, the Nürburgring isn't worth the risk. He calls a meeting of the drivers in an attempt to have it stopped. But his fellow drivers don't agree. He loses by 1 vote and now has no choice but to race.
Der Tod, der ja in Ihrem Geschäft an und für sich ziemlich häufig präsent ist, hat er einen Platz in Ihrem Weltbild, im Weltbild von Niki Lauda?
Na, es ist also ganz klar, dass einfach der Grand Prix-Sport eine gewisse Gefahr mit sich bringt. Und man muss einfach einmal hergehen und diese Gefahr bewältigen. Das heißt, wenn man sie bewältigen kann und weiß, dass man eben dieses Risiko eingeht, weil man es eingehen will, dann wird man weiterfahren.
For the first time in the season, it is raining on race day. But the track is so long that not all of it is wet. The choice of tyres will be crucial.
Wet tyres, they're quite tall. They've got big tread on them like a road tyre, unlike the slicks, which are smooth, no tread at all.
Like most of the field, Lauda starts the race on wet weather tyres, but quickly discovers he is losing too much speed on every dry section of the track.
After the first lap, many drivers come into the pits to change the tires. It was really a chaos. The pit stop was a little bit slow. And when Niki restarted for the second lap with the slick, he was about maybe in 10th position. For a driver, it's not good psychologically to go to race in a circuit that you judge that is too dangerous, because it puts you in a condition that you are afraid. When he restarted on the second lap, was not the cool Niki that we know.
Lauda will not complete the lap. His helmet comes off in the impact, and he is trapped in a fire burning at over 400 degrees centigrade. It will be nearly a minute before Lauda is pulled from the flames.
I put his head in my lap. Didn't want him to lie flat. But he was conscious and talked all the way through. In fact, he asked me, he said, "What's my face? Is it burned? Is it burned?" I replied, no, don't worry about it, it's okay. In fact, his forehead was badly burned and his scalp was actually charred. Rather than telling him all this, we just tried to keep him as quiet and composed as possible.
Lauda is rushed to hospital. Amongst the drivers who arrived just after the crash is James Hunt.
We weren't aware Nicky was in trouble because there were racing drivers at the scene and he was conscious and talking to everybody. So when drivers came back to the pits and said, "Oh, Nicky's burnt, but he's okay, he's fine."
With the track cleared, the race is restarted and Hunt is victorious. He is now just 14 points behind Lauda.
Then the news came through that he was gravely ill, so yeah, just cast a shadow over the whole thing.
I can remember it now. I remember thinking he isn't going to live, and I felt absolutely horrendous. I felt like the bottom had fallen out of my world.
Hier ist die Mannheimer Universitätsklinik Intensivstation, wo sich seit gestern Abend ein Team von Spezialisten unseren verunglückten Niki Lauda.
When we arrived at the hospital, Niki was little by little losing conscience.
Bedrohen würden. Das Problem liegt mehr in den Veränderungen der Lunge, die eingetreten sind durch Einatmen der giftigen Gase und der Substanzen, die bei Rauchentwicklung, bei Bränden mit diesen Automobilen entstehen.
Sind jetzt mit Niki Laudas Mutter direkt in Mannheim verbunden. Gnädige Frau, stimmt es bitte, dass Niki die erste zu befürchtende Krise überwunden hat?
Aber vor Freitag ist also keinerlei, entschuldigen Sie, ich bin selber so aufgeregt. Ich war nur 2 Sekunden bei ihm drin, habe ihm gesagt, dass ich da bin, dass wir alle hier sind. Und er hat mit dem Kopf genickt, also er hat mich voll verstanden.
Danke vielmals, gnädige Frau.
Bitte.
Whilst Lauda battles for his life, Ferrari are already looking for another driver.
So I was speaking with Ferrari all the time about the accident, and Ferrari said to me something, Ferrari will live, with or without Niki. You don't need to stay in the hospital, we need you go back to the circuit and find another driver, because if Niki will not drive, Ferrari will not stop.
Once he had been the protege of Enzo Ferrari. But for Enzo, giving up on the World Championship is not an option.
Press and the public like to concentrate on the driver as being the most important member of the team, but it's not at all. The drivers are very much replaceable. And the unfortunate idea of the 2 McLaren drivers being involved in a motorway accident together and dying, do you think that their team would be on the back row of the grid at the next race? No, they won't be, because they'll just hire 2 more hot shoes and they'll be right up there.
Hunt takes full advantage in the next 2 races, closing the gap to just 2 points.
And with Niki Lauda, his main opponent, likely to be in hospital for some time, his chances of winning the title are pretty good.
Lauda has 2nd and 3rd degree burns to his face and hands. Part of his scalp has been burnt away. He has lost half of one ear, and his lungs are barely working.
But I suddenly was aware of, through the accident, how quickly you can die. I remember my wife coming, and she burst in tears. So she was very much affected when she saw me there. And I said, you know, if she's crying, I must be in a bad stage. But in racing, the risk and taking chances was exactly the same as it was before, because this was part of the game.
Just 40 days after doctors had given up hope and a priest had knelt at his bedside, the Austrian ace climbed back into the cockpit of his glaring red Ferrari. His friends and colleagues claimed that his miracle recovery had more to do with his iron will than with master surgery.
With 5 races left and everything still to play for, Lauda is back.
When I came to the hospital, you know, you feel a kind of you feel like you are very tired, and you would like to go and sleep. But you know it's not just going sleeping; it's something else. And then you just fight with the brain. You hear noises and you hear voices, and you just try to listen what they're saying, and you try to keep your brain working, and to get the body ready to fight against the illness. And I think this was very good that I did that, because in that way I survived.
Niki Lauda was recovering so fast that he proposed to Ferrari to race in Monza.
Ferrari said, no, don't, because if we lose the championship in the end of the year, it's better you don't start so early, because then we can say you had an accident. And this was exactly the opposite what I was thinking.
Glauben Sie selbst daran, dass Sie in Monza Weltmeisterschaftspunkte machen können?
Das ist schwer zu sagen, das kann man erst beurteilen nach dem Training, dass man sieht, wie weit im Training ich vorn liege oder hinten liege und wo der Hand liegt, und das kann man jetzt unmöglich sagen.
Was hätten Sie noch auf dem Herzen, was Sie gerne sagen wollten?
Nix, ich freue mich einfach wieder zu leben, und ich freue mich wieder in meinen Beruf einzusteigen und hoffe, genauso wie in der Vergangenheit, das Beste geben zu werden.
At Lauda's side is his wife, Marlene. She has been with him throughout his recovery, but Monza is the last place she wants him to be.
Haben Sie während der letzten 5 schweren Wochen irgendwann einmal die Idee gehabt, es wäre vielleicht besser, wenn Niki Lauda aufhört, oder haben Sie den Wunsch gehabt?
Nein, ich hab seine Krankheit, wenn man es Krankheit nennen kann, nicht ausgenützt. Zu sagen, Niki, jetzt musst du aufhören. Das wäre so falsch gewesen, weil ich wusste von vorne an, dass er es nie machen würde.
Monza, Italy, home to Ferrari and their fans. After coming within seconds of being burnt to death, Lauda returns to a hero's welcome.
When we went to Monza, the focus was on Niki, 110%. We took him inside the garage. He took out the balaclava, and it was really, his face was a mask of blood, and they say, my God, how can he race?
It was pouring with rain on his return. This is the Nürburgring carrying on almost, you know, the gloom of the Nürburgring.
Is there any psychological after effects from this accident for you at all?
No, I don't think so. Everything looks good.
Lauda prepares to go back on the track to race against the clock for his place on the starting grid.
The pressure was on, the Ferrari called, should I race, should I not race? It was a huge pressure on me for that particular race.
The physical scars have begun to heal, but the mental ones run deeper.
I came to the circuit, wanted to drive out of the pits and couldn't drive. And I suddenly was hit by the whole 4 weeks, accident problems, all these kind of things. And I just couldn't drive. So I did one slow lap, went back into the pits. I said, I go back there and I drive for myself. And in the end of the day, I was quickest Ferrari and was right back like before.
Just before the race begins, Hunt's team, McLaren, are having problems of their own. Their fuel has been ruled to be illegal.
We were made to pump the fuel out of our cars, fill up with standard fuel at the racetrack, and start on the back of the grid. So we were shafted by the Italians. But this is very good. They're very good at this. So the Italian mafiosa managed to get us on the back row of the grid.
How will the feeling be fighting against Nicky again?
Hard work.
When he first met him, James said straight away, he said, "Nicky, you're the only person I know who could be in a fire and come out better looking."
For Nicky, this race is life or death, you know. I finish and I go in the points, or I lose the championship here in Monza.
Stuck at the back of the grid, Hunt makes a charge on the first lap. But as he tries to fight his way through, he almost immediately spins out of the race.
This partisan Italian crowd cheers for only two things today: a Ferrari passing a competitor, or their most serious challenger to the World Championship in trouble. Here it is, the latter.
Poor James, he didn't enjoy the walk back past the Italian fans. Well, actually, thinking about it, knowing James, he probably loved it.
Lauda's wife, Marlene, can only watch.
Incredibly, Nicky finished not only the race, but finished fourth. That was something incredible.
Hunt and McLaren jet off to prepare for the Canadian Grand Prix, but their troubles are far from over. In Paris, Ferrari presents its case for overturning McLaren's win at the British Grand Prix.
There were gentlemen in blazers wearing old-school ties who were meant to decide on matters of whether people should be disqualified, drivers should start or not start. None of them really seem to have read the rule book very clearly.
These three old boys turned up and were introduced to the saintly Nicky before they went in, which was all part of Ferrari's, psychological warfare. So they all went in going, "Oh, we've touched the hand of Saint Nicky."
The verdict goes against McLaren, and 9 vital points are deducted.
So we didn't win the British Grand Prix, and there's no appeal to this appeal. That's it. That's the end of it.
With so many points lost and only 3 races to go, the odds are heavily against Hunt, and the strain is showing between him and Lauda.
Well, Alan, I hope that on the other end of this telephone we have James Hunt, who's a very long way away in Toronto. Hello, James. Good afternoon to you.
Afternoon, Frank.
Now then, disappointed with this decision, but are you really surprised?
Yes, I was very surprised because of the, as far as the rules were concerned, there was no question. Ferrari had no case.
Well, in fact, we've just pulled off the tapes here in London as I've been talking to you, a quote from Nicky Lauda. He has reacted to the news, quite understandably, by saying, "I'm delighted, madly delighted." And he goes on to say that I am satisfied, not just because this will be good for me, but because at least a positive decision has been taken in the interests of the sport. Now, what do you say to that?
Well, it's the sort of rubbish you'd expect. The guy's, had a very bad accident. He's been very brave and done very well. But he'd do well to consider it as a sport.
I see. You are very critical about the way he behaves, are you?
Well, Nicky isn't a sportsman. Nicky's interested in only one thing, and that's Nicky.
No, I don't want to discuss if it was wrong or right, the decision. At least I expected of James to react in the same way, to respect me as a driver and fight if he wants against Ferrari.
I decided that we couldn't possibly win the World Championship from this position now without these points, and stopped trying to control James's excesses, which became quite excessive. We were staying in a great big motel on the side of the freeway in Toronto, and there was a live band playing in the bar. And the lead singer was a bit like Stevie Nicks, blonde little dynamite creature. So James managed to pull her. We had to get up early in the morning to go out to the warm-up, and he came down, dishevelled with this lady, obviously hardly, anyway, dishevelled, like the best way of putting it. Staggered off to the racetrack, won the race. Sex, the breakfast of champions. In this particular case, it worked out.
The win in Canada gives Hunt 9 vital points, and in the next race, he remains on form. He storms through to another victory and takes the podium. But Lauda is still ahead by 3 points. After 10 months and 15 races, the championship has come down to the very last Grand Prix. For the first time ever, the final race is in Japan. Excitement about the season has reached fever pitch. Only 3 points separate Hunt and Lauda. This will be the first race ever to be broadcast live by satellite across the world.
Determined to win it, so in order to do that, the best way for me to do it is to win the race here.
But on race day, the weather threatens to bring the season to a premature end.
It couldn't be worse at the Fuji circuit. Pouring rain, thick mist, and it's a delayed start. So, is the Japanese Grand Prix on or off?
All the drivers got together and said, this is ridiculous. And not only was Niki Lauda saying that, James Hunt also said, this race should not take place.
Getting nice and wet again.
James and Nicky were both on the driver's safety committee, so they were in the tower arguing that the race shouldn't be held. So we had this direct confrontation, but I was saying to him, we don't race, James, you can't win the World Championship. Oh, no, chap, we can't race, it's too dangerous. So all very, very above board, but a bit irritating when you're trying to win the World Championship, and you can't, obviously, if you don't race.
The race has now been delayed for nearly 2 hours. The rain continues to fall, but the race organizers have reached a decision.
And at 4, then the race director came in and said, we have to start. And we all looked out and said, excuse me, it's the same rain as before. Why? Because of television.
In 2 hours will be too dark, and we have the satellite TV that costs a lot of money, and we have a contract with the organizer to at least start the race. Otherwise, we lose money. The teams, the drivers, I lose the money if we don't at least start the race.
But the race is on. James Hunt in his McLaren, getting ready for a lap of the circuit. And next, out comes Niki Lauda to join the grid with the rest of the competitors.
The drivers have been forced onto the starting grid by the demands of the vast TV audience they have created.
This then is the clincher, the World Championship decider. 3 points separate the leader, Niki Lauda in the Ferrari, and Britain's James Hunt in the McLaren. It's going to be a fantastic race.
In Britain, it's 3 in the morning. Hunt's parents and friends are watching the live satellite broadcast in a TV studio. But his sister, Sally, is at home, glued to the radio.
We switched on the radio very early in the morning, and I can remember walking around the house with the radio clamped to my ear. The tension was just amazing.
And who is going to reach the corner first? The flag is down. Flag is down, and Hunt is edging practically ahead. Front racers side by side. And it's James Hunt who takes the lead in the Japanese Grand Prix. And fifth, or sixth, is Niki Lauda. Hunt with close of the race, flying up from the Lauda McLaren.
Hunt takes the lead, but for the other drivers following, the water spray is dangerously reducing visibility to almost zero. and all the cars are skidding and sliding in the heavy rain.
Van Willen's going through, and Hunter's let Van. No, he hasn't let him pass. Side by side, Van Willen up, and Van Willen spins, and he missed Hunt by inches. This is what, and Niki Lauda has pulled into the pits in front of us. Niki Lauda, the world champion, has pulled into the pits.
Niki stopped because, you know, it's too dangerous. I stop.
Yes, this amazing 1976 World Championship Series is maintaining its drama because Niki Lauda, leading the World Championship, is out of the race. But, amazingly enough, there's nothing wrong with his car.
I tell him, Niki, what we have to say that you have a technical failure or something? No, he said to me, tell them that it is too dangerous to race.
When you are a normal racing driver and not affected by an accident, you have reserves. So that means your level of risk-taking is higher than you, like in my case, you just come out of death and had everything happening to you. And then a couple of races later, you have to face this more difficult situation with the water and rain and risk going up. And at that time, I was not prepared to take this extra risk because of the accident.
And emotionally, for me, it was impossible to tell Niki, you know, to go back to race. Because you see, his eyes was really terrorized.
Lauda is out of the race, but he will still become world champion if Hunt fails to score enough points.
And then the rain stopped and the water disappeared on the circuit, and the circuit got better by a coincidence, basically. And but I was not racing, and I still would do the same today.
Hunt must finish third or higher to take the championship. But as the track dries out, his wet weather tyres begin to overheat.
One of the techniques you could do is cool them down by running in puddles deliberately on the straights. So we put this sign out, cool tyres, but James refused to acknowledge or do this. Cool the tyres! Cool the tyres! And he's down the middle of the road, oblivious. Eventually, he wore all the rubber off them, all the canvas, down to the air, and he had 2 flat tyres.
And with 5 laps to go, he came into the pits. We thought that perhaps it was all going to go wrong for James.
And Hunt is in the pits in second place. And if he drops below 4, if he goes out, his world championship is going to be in danger. What an incredible change of fortune.
Because he had 2 flat tyres, we couldn't jack the car up very well. So the car was too low to get the jack underneath. So a mechanic and I had to pick up the left front of the car. So it took us like 24 seconds or something to change the tyres.
And James Hunt gets away. Now he is in 5th position and out of the contention.
With the championship seemingly beyond his grasp, Hunt the sportsman throws caution to the wind and makes his charge for the finish.
And James Hunt is passing Jones. Hunt is 4th, and Regazzoni is out of the race. So now Hunt moves up to 3rd position. And James Hunt is going to win the World Championship if he just keeps going in the place he's in now. And he does it.
James Hunt finishes 3rd. James Hunt is champion of the world.
And we were all whizzing about, sort of cheering and excited because James was now world champion.
I think the scenes in the McLaren pit will speak for themselves.
But right now, Hunt himself has no idea the championship is his.
James Hunt came into the pits in a rage. And as the McLaren team gathered round, James got out of the car, pulled off his crash helmet, started to rant and rave at them. And Teddy Mayer was holding up 3 fingers saying, "James, you're 3rd, you're champion." And gradually, the penny dropped. It was an extraordinary moment.
There was a lot of excitement and does he know yet, and is it true? And then suddenly it was true, and he was world champion.
Hunt has won despite ignoring team orders.
I was not best pleased with him. You won't see me in any of the photographs, so I'm nowhere near him, because I just want to punch him in the mouth. Even though he is the world champion.
Yeah, well, you know, I feel really sorry for Nicky, in that I feel sorry for everybody that the race had to be run in such ridiculous circumstances. And quite honestly, you know, I wanted to win the championship, and I felt that I deserved to win the championship. I also felt that Nicky deserved to win the championship, and I just wish we could have shared it.
I said at the same time, at the time there, if anybody should get a championship, then I'm happy it's James, yeah? Because I liked him, and we were not bodies, but we were at least sympathetic. So I think we took care of each other from the heart in a very nice way, which in these days the heart was never shown in Formula One.
Hunt, who came into Heathrow early today, said, "I don't think I've stopped celebrating since the race."
Well, we met James coming home. There was James looking slightly dazed, was probably say completely out of it. He'd drunk quite a lot on the way home.
Very tired and somewhat hungover, thank you very much.
What was the party like?
It was long, but good.
And then we all went off to a party. And I have to say my memory is a bit hazy after that, because I think I drank more champagne for breakfast than I ever had before.
Hunt and Lauda would never have such a close race again. But the legacy of the first superstars of Grand Prix helped shape Formula One into the global TV sport it is today.
The excitement of that season meant that no self-respecting country could allow its television service not to cover Formula One properly. So suddenly Formula One was available everywhere.
We had James and Nicky coming out of this as these two titans of their time. Who could have predicted that? It was just the most amazing season.
In life you need a certain amount of luck, but now the question is how much luck you need. I think the luck is the minimum. I think human beings can do much more for themselves than they think.
We have to remember only the good things, and it was a good fight.
I don't think I thought of him as my little brother then, although that's what he was, but I just thought, no, it's James who my love and my friend, and he's achieved what he wants to achieve. And that was very exciting.
How do you want to do it? Do you want to go at a steady pace for 70 years, or do you want to go flat out for 10 years and then relax? And I rather like doing it that way.
At the time, we said, if you wrote this as a film script, people will say, that's ridiculous. You've got to have something believable. You can't have this farcical story. But the farcical story is true.
Motors of the two-wheeled variety. A reminder that there's highlights from the MotoGP qualifiers on the iPlayer. Next tonight on BBC Two, from priceless artworks to weighty wind turbines, all in a day's work for the Crane Gang.